So, let's talk about Henry Ford. When that name comes up, what do you think of? For most of us, it's cars, right? The assembly line, the Model T, the guy who basically put America and the world on wheels. But that's not the whole story, not even close. The full picture is way more complicated and honestly, pretty disturbing.
And right there, that single sentence, that's the whole story in a nutshell, isn't it? It's just so jarring. On one hand, you've got this visionary who literally created the modern workweek. On the other, you have an ideologue who inspired one of history's greatest monsters. Those are the two Henry Fords we're going to unpack today. Okay, so first let's talk about the Ford we all know, the one we learn about in school, the industrial genius. This is the guy who didn't just start a car company, he completely reinvented the way we make, well, everything.
Just look at this timeline. The speed is incredible. We're talking less than 20 years to go from a guy tinkering in a garage with his quadricycle to fundamentally changing global manufacturing. The real game changer, the moment everything clicks into place, is 1913 with the moving assembly line. That was the breakthrough.
In this quote, and you've probably heard it, it just perfectly captures this whole mindset. This wasn't about giving people options. It was about pure, relentless efficiency. And why black? Well, it's simple. Black paint was the only color that dried fast enough to keep up with his assembly line. For Ford, it was all about standardization and speed to make things affordable.
And what was the result of that philosophy? This number. Over 15 million Model Ts rolled off the line by 1927. Just let that sink in. For that time period, that number is almost unbelievable. This wasn't just a car, it was a cultural force that completely reshaped American life. And that's really the key here. The Model T made car ownership possible for the average person. I mean, look at this. The price plunged from over $800 down to $360 in just 8 years. By 1918, half the cars on the road in America were Model Ts. All of a sudden, regular families had the freedom to travel. Ford wasn't just selling a machine, he was selling mobility to the masses.
Now let's move on to another one of Ford's big revolutionary ideas. One that made him look like a true champion of the working class. The famous $5 day. These numbers are just stunning. In 1914, the average auto worker was making a little over $2 a day. Ford comes along and announces he's going to pay his workers $5 a day. He more than doubled their wages, overnight. It sent shockwaves through the entire economy. His competitors thought he was insane, and thousands of men lined up for blocks trying to get a job.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just him being a nice guy. It was an absolutely brilliant, if maybe a little cynical, business move. See, the monotonous work on the assembly line led to huge turnover, which was expensive. By paying more, he got the best, most reliable workers. And, in what was maybe his most genius insight, he realized that if you pay your workers a middle-class wage, they can afford to buy your product. He was creating his own customers.
And he didn't even stop there. In 1926, he introduces another idea that sounds completely normal to us now but was radical then. The 5-day, 40-hour workweek. The weekend was born. And his logic was the same. Give people more leisure time, and they'll need things to do in that time, like, say, take a drive in their new Ford. From the outside, Henry Ford looked like the most forward-thinking boss in the world.
So that leads to the obvious question. With the high pay and weekends off, Ford's factories must have been a worker's paradise, right? Well, not exactly. The reality inside those walls was a whole different story.
And this is where the story takes a really dark turn. This is where that heroic image of Ford starts to fall apart. Because for all his progressive policies, there was one thing he hated with a passion and was willing to fight against with brutal force: labor unions.
So how did he enforce his anti-union rule? He created something called the Ford Service Department. Now, that sounds harmless, but it was anything but. It was run by a guy named Harry Bennett, a former boxer, and it was basically Ford's private army. A security force of spies and thugs whose one and only job was to intimidate, threaten, and beat down any worker who even thought about organizing.
And we're talking about real, documented violence. In 1932, during the Depression, his security forces opened fire on unemployed protesters, killing 5 people. Then there's the infamous Battle of the Overpass in 1937, where union organizers were viciously beaten in broad daylight in front of photographers. It took years of this kind of bloody resistance before Ford finally gave in. He was the very last automaker in Detroit to recognize the union.
But as dark as the anti-union violence was, Ford's legacy gets even darker. Now we have to talk about the most disturbing part of his story, where he took his genius for mass production and applied it to spreading hate. In 1918, Ford bought his hometown newspaper and turned it into his personal megaphone for some of the most vile anti-Semitic propaganda you can imagine. He published a 91-part series of hateful articles and then used his corporate power to spread them, forcing every Ford dealership in the country to carry and distribute the paper.
And it didn't just stay in the newspaper. Those articles were collected and published as a book with the horrifying title, The International Jew. It was translated into over a dozen languages and spread all across the globe, becoming a foundational text for hate groups in Europe and the United States. In that influence, it reached the absolute worst people imaginable. In an interview, Adolf Hitler himself called Harry Ford his inspiration. He reportedly kept a portrait of Ford in his office. In fact, Ford is the only American that Hitler praises by name in his manifesto Mein Kampf. And this wasn't a one-way admiration. In 1938, on his 75th birthday, the Nazi regime in Germany gave Henry Ford this, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. It was the highest award a foreigner could receive from the Third Reich, a truly chilling symbol of their mutual respect.
So that brings us back to the beginning. How do we even begin to make sense of this person? How can the visionary innovator also be this hateful ideologist? Who was the real Henry Ford?
It's all right here, laid out side by side, the two Fords. On one side, you have the things that literally built modern America, the affordable car, the assembly line, the living wage, the weekend. And on the other side, a legacy of pure poison, brutal violence against his own workers, and an ideology of hate that helped fuel a genocide. It feels impossible that they could exist in the same person, but they do.
And that's the question we're ultimately left with, isn't it? How are we supposed to remember a man like this? He's a core part of the American story. A man whose genius for building things was maybe only matched by his commitment to an ideology meant to tear people apart. To really understand him, you have to grapple with both sides of that coin, the brilliant light and the profound, terrifying darkness.